That's absolutely true. And we hear about those sort of benefits of sport all the time in terms of exercise and all this sort of stuff. But I suppose for me anyway, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this too, but for me, sport almost runs so much deeper than that, in the sense that I suppose if you look at sport at a really sort of broad level, it's almost that idea of sport is making order out of chaos and trying to present chaos to your opposition so that they're not able to make order out of it. So like I follow sort of a whole range of sports sort of thing, but I look at, for example, two sports like golf and boxing. And you look at people who follow golf and people who follow boxing and the participants in both those respective sports as well. And I would almost wonder whether the paradigm in which they live their lives is slightly different around those ideas of order and chaos. So you hear about sort of some of the heavyweight boxers who've really excelled in boxing over the journey, and some of them have had quite tough lives. Violence and aggression have been very prevalent, whether it be throughout their childhoods and, gone through sort of things in adulthood. Look at someone like Mike Tyson, and even though he got to sort of the top of the world in terms of his sport, he was still very much someone who was, I suppose, trapped in that almost that paradigm of sort of violence and aggression, and he's been very open about speaking of this. Whereas you look at sort of the participants of golf, and maybe it's seen as sort of something slightly more white collar. Maybe the people who are attracted to golf live in a slightly different paradigm in terms of chaos and order. So for me, you look at all the sort of different sports, and if we look at sort of, I suppose, the rules of a particular sport as, say, the parameters with which we can all work in many ways, I think sport is such a metaphor for life in that sense because of those two ideas of order and chaos. And there aren't really any sports that don't, I suppose, contend with those two themes.
Yeah, I like that. I like that order versus chaos idea, and looking at sport as a metaphor for life, as you say. And look, I suppose a couple of things that come to mind with that. Well, one of the things that comes into sport is about rules, isn't it? That there are rules and there's guidelines. And so that's a kind of setting of boundaries as well. It's learning how to manage with boundaries. But just say in terms of rules, we partly have that. So you end up with, say, a winner and a loser. And a lot of life is very complex and ambiguous and all the rest of it. So I think that's something that also people appreciate, that in sport you end up with something a little bit more known. Maybe that's part of the order you're mentioning. It's sort of you end up with a winner and a loser. But one thing interests me in terms of boundaries that I might mention, that sport is a way of learning a bit about controlled aggression, if we talk about boundaries and things like that. So what struck me years ago is learning that there was an increase in violent crime in young women or adolescent girls, where at times the crimes were dramatically increasing in the severity of the violence involved. And they thought this was happening or increasing a little bit more with girls. And some people speculated that maybe this was partly because at that stage girls didn't engage as much in competitive physical sport. So that's how a lot of boys, and then to young men, actually learn how to manage their aggression better.
Well, I think if we go back to that idea of boxing and martial arts, one thing that's so big in that sport is the idea of you don't take anything outside the ring, or you don't take anything outside the octagon. And to extend that idea of people living within their paradigm, part of, I think, the appeal and part of the value in sports like boxing and martial arts is that they are able to take people who are in situations where they may be prone to anger, maybe prone to violent crimes, all this sort of stuff, but they're actually able to sort of say, hold on, let's channel that into a sport where everyone sort of agrees on the rules and the parameters, and again, they're able to, for lack of a better term, translate the chaos that they're living in their sort of everyday life, and they're able to distill that down into whether it be the ring or whether it be on the field. And yeah, I completely agree that that's one of the real sort of values that sport sort of teaches us.